title that's bringing us together today, Becoming Multilingual Allies and Activists, Fostering Cultural and Linguistic Collaboration in the Classroom. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Gail Prasad, who is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto, Canada. Her research investigates teaching for critical multilingual language awareness, as well as teachers' and students' language and literacies practices in and out of linguistically and culturally diverse school contexts. She employs arts-based and creative multimodal methodologies to engage children and youth actively in representing their experiences as plurilingual actors in their schools and communities. Her research in Canada, the US, and in France has been published in English and French. It's my true pleasure to welcome Dr. Prasad, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Eve, and to the organizers and to everybody here today. It's really a privilege to be with you, and thank you for that introduction. I have really focused this talk to be as practical as it can be, to show you some examples of the inspiring things that teachers that I've been working with, largely in the US, have been doing as we've sought to support students in becoming what we've defined as plurilingual allies and activists. So let me figure out how to advance my slides here. There we go. I just want to start out this afternoon and pause for an acknowledgement of the land where I'm located here in Toronto, being mindful in the context of this conference on Shifting Linguistic Landscapes of the ways in which Indigenous languages and their speakers are rooted to the land and sustained in community. York University recognizes the many Indigenous nations that have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University, and York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now become home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities, and we acknowledge the current treaty holders. I've lost the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I think when we are on Zoom and using these technologies, it's also important that we recognize that we are connected to places where these technologies are rooted and are in direct participation in the ongoing extraction of resources from these lands. And so I also just want to acknowledge the original inhabitants and current Indigenous peoples of the land where Zoom is headquartered in San Jose, California, the Muwekma Ohlone peoples. And so I invite you to also acknowledge the peoples of the land where you find yourself this afternoon in the chat as we enter into this talk about being plurilingual allies and moving towards a linguistic reconciliation in our classrooms. And so for the outline today, what I would like to talk about is beginning just with some definitions of the terms that I'm going to be using, and then talk about the context in which I've been working. From there, we're going to talk about a research practice partnership that I think is similar to the way the University of Calgary has partnered with the Calgary Board of Education. I want to talk about teaching for critical multilingual language awareness and how that has helped us cultivate linguistic and cultural collaboration in the classroom, and ultimately making a move from language awareness to language activism in the community. So in terms of terms and definitions, we've heard a lot today, starting with our opening keynote, about the multilingual turn and this understanding of a shift in recognizing the practices of multilingual users and the complex ways in which they engage in languaging. and a traditional view that that is counter to a traditional view of multilingualism that has viewed multilingual as someone with multiple separate monolingualisms who count according to their degree of proficiency. Ofelia Garcia reminded us of this idea that we are always emerging, that we are developing our languages over the course and scope of our lives. And the term that I was acquainted with as I was doing my doctoral work in Canada and in France was that of plurilingualism, coming from the French originally and then introduced into English through the work of the Council of Europe as an individual's interrelated network of languages and of cultural practices. And this image or this notion has suggested that we do have this dynamic overlapping variation of languages and between languages, and we focus on the use. So we develop them according to context and purpose. And I like to think about it as weaving a communicative repertoire. So the languages that are a part of the world around us also become woven into the fabric of our beings. And we can begin to identify with them or not, but they still are, they become a part of us. And our role, I think, in schooling is to allow students to weave more complex repertoires, to leave school with more than that which they began. And so I am taken by what Blomart, Collins, and Slenbrook have talked about in terms of the study of multilingualism needing to attend to both macro conditions and micro processes. And I visualize it in this way, that we are like this circle, the individual with a communicative repertoire. And you can see that they have a little bit of blue, some variation there, some blending, and then predominantly a red circle. And they then move through various institutions in society that either recognize or match the communicative repertoire of the individual or not. And you can see as this individual moves through school, there is a little bit of correspondence, but not very much. And they can continue to move through to find resources in society, such as in the library, in the wider society, and then find a place of resonance in their homes. And so Blomart, Collins, and Slenbrook have asked us, or have pointed out, that a lack of communicative competence is not a problem of the speaker, but a problem for the speaker. And in my work, I've been looking at how we conceptualize schools as spaces of multilingualism rather than monolingualism. And that's where the work around allyship has come into my work and thinking. And allyship has been defined as an active, sustained, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating, in which a person in a position of privilege and power seeks to operate in solidarity with a minoritized group or with minoritized groups. So what does this have to do with language? Well, I would suggest that we can all become plurilingual allies. We won't necessarily all do so, but we all have the capacity to. And some of the ways in which we might exercise solidarity with minoritized language users are by first acknowledging our linguistic privilege, as in many cases, the teachers I'm working with say, you know, I'm a monolingual Anglophone. I don't speak the languages of my students. How am I going to work with the 27 languages that are present here? And so we also can develop our multilingual awareness. We can disrupt monolingualism as being the norm. We can develop the practice of multilingual listening, engage in linguistic risk-taking, actively pursue opportunities to collaborate and to work collaboratively with people from minoritized social, cultural, and linguistic backgrounds. And then we can advocate actively for linguistic reconciliation and social justice. And so one of the ways that we can do this, I believe, is by shifting our positioning of learners, not as dominant English speakers or English learners, or not even as bilingual learners and dominant English speakers, but really embracing a plurilingual or a multilingual, a dynamic multilingual perspective of all students as being capable of this language growth. And so I would say we can move, and we have moved in many ways, towards a more supportive approach to language and teaching in multilingual schools. And there are many people who are also, many teachers who are also working to be inclusive of the minoritized language learner. But I think that we can go further. And in a time where social movements attending to issues related to power have called our attention, we can recognize that we have an opportunity to engage in linguistically expansive teaching and learning. And that happens through what Dr. Mary-Paule Lory, who presented this morning in French, and I have described as linguistic and cultural collaboration. And linguistic and cultural collaboration takes place when educators, students, and various actors in the community engage critically and creatively in the collective transformation of a deficit view of linguistic and cultural plurality and the deconfiguration of coercive power relations and exclusionary policies. In the classroom, linguistic and cultural collaboration is shaped by purposeful instructional choices that foster space for deconstructing social representations of minoritized languages and cultural groups in order to co-construct all students and educators as agentive, plurilingual social actors. So I've been working in a variety of contexts, and a lot of this thinking started out for me in Toronto, personally growing up in Toronto, but then also working with teachers and teacher candidates in this context of great linguistic diversity. And then in my doctoral work, going to Montpellier, France, in southern France, which was a much smaller community, but still had a lot of linguistic diversity, particularly in schools. And then following my doctorate, I moved to Madison, Wisconsin, which again was, for me, a small town. I was corrected and told that it was a small city. But again, at a time when they were beginning to see multilingualism being the norm in classrooms. And so two of the schools I want to talk about today are Diversitas, and they are a mainstream English school with an English learner population that was about 29%. And this was higher than the average in the school district. And they had the largest percentage of Arabic speakers, as well as enough Spanish speakers in the school to warrant the creation of a bilingual program. But this school had 22 different languages that were spoken, and the principal had already taken initiatives to try and start writing on the walls in the languages that were spoken by students, and trying to reflect students' identities through signage that was within the school. And the other school that I've been working with has been a two-way immersion school, La Nueva Escuela Bilingüe, and they follow a 90-10 model with Spanish speakers, with 50% Spanish speakers and 50% English speakers. And again, you will see here that according to this bilingual model, they would say they have a 52% English language learner population. And so we began to build a research practice partnership following a social design-based research methodology, which Wang and Hannafin have described as a systematic but flexible methodology aimed to improve educational practices through iterative analysis, design, implementation, or development, implementation, based on collaboration among researchers and practitioners in real-world settings, leading to contextually sensitive design principles and theories. So it was important for us to be working with teachers in classrooms that reflected other schools across the district. And the question we were set out to look at together was, how can we leverage multilingualisms in schools as a resource for learning and for building social understanding and belonging for all learners? So whereas a lot of literature that has focused on serving multilingual learners has really looked at how do we serve emerging bilinguals in acquiring the language of instruction while also honoring and recognizing the linguistic resources they bring to the classroom. Our work was focused not only on supporting minoritized language learners, but also in recognizing that work needed to be done with English dominant speakers. How do we create spaces of belonging for both of these groups, in which growth on both parts would be required? And for me, I've looked at this through two images, that rather than thinking about schools as being a place that should reflect students' identities as a mirror, that we should be able to look at schools as spaces of encounter that would allow us to refract identity possibilities so that we could see ourselves as plurilingual allies, even if we don't speak multiple different languages. So we built this partnership starting in 2016, where I've started working with elementary teachers, teaching science through the prism of children's plurilingualism. We worked with, I think it was 5 different teachers in kindergarten and grade 1, and designed science-based texts that were published in the languages that were spoken by students and their families. At the end of the year, the principal said, you know, I really would love to be doing this across my whole school from kindergarten to grade 5. What if we hired a teacher part-time to design collaborative content-based multilingual projects? Would you work with them all year? And that was a researcher's dream. And so with the support of the university and a host of graduate students, we worked with a new teacher to design collaborative content-based multilingual projects from kindergarten to grade 5. At the end of that year, the principal said, I would like to start actually teaching about multilingual language awareness. And so in that school in Diversitas, we started having a 30-minute instructional period for students to learn about different languages, their speakers, and their histories. And we also started working on designing projects within the context of bilingual education at La Nueva Escuela. And this work has continued even though I'm now located at York University, through graduate students who've continued to gather their data and support the work of teachers, along with the teachers who have been trained and are carrying forward. So there are 5 main principles that have come about based on this work, that have helped us shape how we have been developing curriculum and practice. And so first of all, we've taken a language ecology approach that is both culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining, but also revitalizing, recognizing that we have a role to play, not just in sustaining languages that students speak and come from, but also recognizing the indigenous languages that are a part of the land that these schools are on and the places where these children have come from. We've sought to foster collaboration, not just between students, but also with family members, with larger school members, and even beyond with community members. We focused on developing mediational competence, meaning metalinguistic awareness and multilingual awareness as both plurilingual listeners and speakers. So even if I am not able to speak other languages, I can develop the capacity to listen to others and to make meaning, to construct, to build relationships, and to not be afraid to take linguistic risks. And we center on creativity through production pedagogies and through the centering of children as creative plurilingual experts. Childhood is one of these special things that we actually age out of. I think many parents right now would say, thankfully, we age out of our childhood and become adults. But there is something special about this wonder that is held there. And we want to really leverage that ability to be creative and to showcase our capacity to make sense of the world. And we want to equip students for collaborative critical action so that we can move from just multilingual awareness to a critical plurilingual allyship and activism. And so Understanding the 5 domains of critical multilingual language awareness have been at the base or the foundation of all of our planning, attending to the cognitive and performance dimensions that are routinely assessed in schools, but also attending to the affective and the social that are so important in our learning. And most critically, the dimension of power, recognizing the histories of minoritized speakers and their struggles, the critical awareness of the social construction of language norms and standardization, and a critical reflection about how power is always tied up with languages, language users, and language learners. So we put power at the center of all classroom dialogue and action on languages, users, and linguistic diversity. So I want to look at some examples about why this work has become, why we think this is necessary and what it has been able to achieve. Here you'll see we did a unit related to The Very Hungry Caterpillar, which is a very familiar text that kids were very fond of. And we had translations in 27 different languages. And we asked students to sort book covers with The Very Hungry Caterpillar into categories or into groups. And this was a conversation that unfolded. The researcher says, "How are you grouping your caterpillars?" Meaning their book covers. Student 1, well, we're grouping them into multilingual and monolingual, and then we're grouping into the multilingual ones into ones that use human letters, and I mean English letters, and those that don't. That's interesting. So tell me more about the ones you said use English letters. Well, these ones use human. I mean English letters. Why do I keep saying that? Well, that's a good question. Why do you think you keep saying human instead of English? And as this conversation unfolded, it happened in every single class that we did this activity with, this reference to certain languages being human. And the teacher's reaction initially was one of great concern because she recognized the implications of children's assumptions that some languages might be more human than others simply because we could not understand them. And in our work, we have come across many of these moments that initially strike teachers and observers as being students are saying things that have significant weight for how we think about languages and how we think about their users. And so we said these are not opportunities that we want to shut down, but rather we want to hold up to have conversations about what are the social representations that are being put forward that are surfacing as a result of making language something that we can talk about. And in our the two-way immersion school that we were working with, we often had people come in to share readings in different languages. And in this case, one of our research team members was reading Brown Bear, Brown Bear in Korean. And the teacher reflected, you know, kids, she was concerned because kids started laughing, maybe because they were nervous, because they didn't know how to react to hearing other languages, even though they were in a bilingual school. And so she emphasizes that even within a bilingual setting, there are these monoglossic dispositions that that we have come to accept and that we need to denaturalize, and that it's safe for us to say, you know, we might be uncomfortable hearing another language, but what are the strategies we begin to use so that we can become allies and to become active plurilingual listeners, even if we can't speak those languages. So what does this look like? How do we foster this linguistic and cultural collaboration in the classroom? Here is briefly a scope and sequence of what was happening at Diversitas through thematic units, project creation, which was multilingual, publishing of multilingual books, creating based on a mentor text that we had in different languages that was available in different languages, and then other opportunities that were brainstormed for how we take this work further, particularly relying on the arts and on technology. And so here you see an example of a text that was created in first grade, reinforcing science content, but doing so multilingually. And students were doing a unit on plants and learning about writing nonfiction text. And so each child was responsible for contributing to this collaborative writing project. And then it was translated with the help of family and community members and illustrated into a multilingual book. Here is another example that shows a grade 3 project on earth science. And I'm showing this example to simply highlight that at some points we are having students translate entire texts based on their language abilities in those languages, and in others they are focusing on words that are key to the text and to their understanding, and the other languages that they might have access to. And so we're trying to create an openness and access point that recognizes that our multilingual and plurilingual competence is going to be different in different languages, but it can all be used to help reinforce our content understanding. So here is an example of using a multilingual mentor text, and we were doing Brown Bear, again by Eric Carle. He's just a popular author that has many translations. And again, being able to access these books allowed us to then look at the science content of studying habitats, and students then wrote and illustrated about where animals live. So for months I had Pinguino, Pinguino, donde vives in my head, echoing what kids had been saying with me when we were in schools. And in this example, we also are trying to build metalinguistic and multilingual awareness. And so at the end of every book, we did a comparison of the different animals that appeared, as well as the different languages that became part of our books. And this photo shows a parent coming in to read in Yucatec Mayan. And for us, this was an important inclusion of an Indigenous language. And the parent, recognized that Brown Bear does not exist in this Indigenous language, but he had access to a story, an Indigenous tale about a nightingale, and so he offered to read that. And again, this is where we need to be flexible, that if we are going to make space for other languages and other resources, that we can adapt. Say we're doing a unit on animals, on animal habitats. Some of these animals may not exist in different cultures or contexts because of their location, but we still want to include this knowledge, and so we'll welcome it in a different form. As we continue doing this type of work over 4 years, while I was there at least, we began to observe that students' conversations about languages and their use and who they belong to became much more naturalized. And so here, students were looking at Le Petit Prince, and again, we were able to talk about why are there so many translations available of this text and not others. And in this activity, they were being asked to create posters about of drawing a sheep as a famous line from the book. And a student is asking, as he compares examples, is this Arabic or Hebrew? I'm confused. And one of his peers responds, well, I know this is Arabic because this is how you spell my dad's name. So he can recognize and affirm his association with the language. And the other student can then say, well, then I can figure out that the other one is Hebrew. And another student adds, well, I chose to use Japanese because it looks cool, and my karate teacher uses Japanese. So they're making personal connections here, even if they aren't necessarily proficient speakers or would identify as being bilinguals or multilinguals. Here is another example of a classroom teacher coming together with the music teacher, and students were learning Harris J's song Salam Alaikum. And they also read the book, and then they started illustrating lyrics and talking about how we share peace. This led into a unit on similes and poetry and translating their similes about friendship into a variety of different languages. And I use this example simply to show that there are analog versions of these types of pedagogies that aren't contingent on having access to technology. So parents were able to handwrite translations to supply them for schools, and we were able to scan them and include them in students' productions. I'm just looking at the time. Okay. So we also saw that we were engaging students in having opportunity to build relationships with people from different linguistic backgrounds. And after we published these books, we had students write thank you notes to families. And in this case, the boy that you see in the picture was writing a thank you note to a family who had translated for us into Arabic. And his friend was the Arabic speaker. So he started writing and he took his message to his friend and said, did I write in Arabic correctly? And he said, well, no, we write in the other direction. And so he went back and rewrote his note. And the picture you see in the middle is what he produced and showed his friend. And his friend found this quite humorous. And he said, well, what is that? And if you take a moment and look, you can see that what this child has done is that he has reversed the English and written it from right to left. So it says, dear Karim's family, shukran for being so kind and helping us make this book in different languages. And so he's literally applied the instruction that was given to him, and this allowed for a conversation about directionality of print and conventions, but it also showed the skills of bilingual speakers that we don't, as Ophelia referenced this morning, we don't usually ask monolinguals to take on practices of bilinguals. And in that way, monolingualism is normalized. But in this case, because we're asking them to take risks, we do ask children who are monolingual to say, put yourself in the place of someone who's trying to communicate in another language and take those risks, and do so with the support of these bilingual experts who are your peers. And so we made a point to also celebrate critical, creative, multilingual productions through gallery walks and celebrations. And this school continued to see that parent involvement in the school was at an all-time high, that parents who would never come to the school before started coming to these multilingual events. And one of the major outcomes was that at the end of the second year of doing this work, the district found that in their annual climate survey, this school had the highest percentage reported of sense of belonging amongst minoritized student populations. And that was one of the major reasons we had set out to do this work. But it also just reinforced the fact that when we create inviting spaces for students to bring their whole selves to their learning, that they become affirmed and that this is a place they want to be. So how do we move just from awareness of these other languages to activism? Well, that happened, because students were taking these risks, and one of the grade 4 classes produced multilingual brochures about Wisconsin history after visiting the Wisconsin History Museum. And they realized that you could go to the Wisconsin History Museum and learn about histories that were part of their heritage, but that if you didn't speak English, you couldn't necessarily access all of the information. So they put together these bilingual, trilingual brochures, and the Wisconsin Historical Museum then invited students to share these brochures in their museum, and they hosted a public reading of them in which families came together, and the school district provided taxi chits for families to be able to go downtown to the museum if they didn't have access to transportation, so that they could participate. And from there, students and family members were doing readings in the various languages. And what struck me was that all of a sudden we saw families and students cheering for students to read in Arabic, in French, in Spanish, in minoritized languages that didn't have a space or a voice in these spaces before. And to be greeted with cheering and positivity was a real confidence booster for both these families and for these students. And another example that emerged was after doing this work over the course of 4 years, parents started saying that these books should be not just published at school, but they should go into our public libraries. And this idea, of course, was exciting to children. One of the parents happened to work with the library, and so she brought the idea to the library head, and they then said, you know, we're going to make a commitment to purchase these books every year so that we can continue to support you doing this type of work. So students then were seeing themselves as people who could make change in their communities to allow there to be books that reflected who they were, as well as in content that they were learning at schools. And so when schools and libraries, when public forces join forces, there is so much more that we can do to begin to be transforming our societies. So I'm going to just end here on this teacher's reflection, where she said at the end of the project, you know, we have a more peaceful society if we're more exposed to each other. Because when you don't know each other, you tend to fear the other and make negative assumptions. So when we're all learning about each other, things become more natural. And I think the future may become more peaceful. Now, I'm not about to suggest that this is going to change everything for everyone, but I do think that shifting linguistic norms within classrooms and adopting a linguistically expansive orientation, particularly at this moment in time, can allow us to move practice and pedagogy forward, as well as our understanding of what the potential is for multilingual education theoretically. So in conclusion, I would say that by adopting a linguistically expansive orientation to teaching and learning, teachers can make explicit how all students can draw on and expand their communicative repertoires as resources for deepening learning and building social ties. As students from different linguistic, cultural, and social backgrounds work collaboratively on creative and critical multilingual content-based projects, they engage in linguistic risk-taking that develops their mediational competence as both speakers and listeners in dynamic multilingual interactions. By design, then, students become invested in supporting one another to accomplish multilingual and multimodal work that they could not do alone. And as they develop critical multilingual language awareness in community, they can become plurilingual allies and activists beyond the classroom. So here are 2 resources that might be of interest to teachers and researchers. One is a website, I am plurilingual, je suis plurilingue, that comes out of the work that I've done in Canada and in France. And then the Multilingual Reach website, which is based on the work in Madison, Wisconsin. And so I'm going to stop there. And here's just a list of our team members.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Prasad. You're getting some lovely notes in the chat here about the amazing work, and we're going to move into the question and answer period. So as people are preparing their questions, I thought I just would, I wanted to personally thank you for the very, very rich collection of student work and examples that show how practice can go beyond sort of a service orientation to that leveraging of students' funds of knowledge in the classroom. The examples that you provided are fabulous. And one of my other big takeaways is the new metaphor on moving from the mirror as a reflection to that prism and that refraction. So thank you so much for contribution to my thinking, at least today. And I'd like to open it up to the floor. If you have some questions, you can add them into the chat, or if you're feeling up for it, feel free to turn on your mic and video, and you can pose the question directly. You're getting lots of thanks.
I was going to say, I didn't mention it, but I think one of the exciting additions, I just hear someone commenting about parents who might not be literate in their home languages, is that one of the affordances of technology has been that we've been able to include QR codes with oral recordings of the readings. And that has been a key, game changer also for families who have said, we're really interested by the other languages we see represented, but we can't read them at home. And so being able to have students work on recordings allowed us to also work on fluency in reading, while also bringing these other languages home, as well as including them in the schools.
Thank you. I'm just noticing here that I have, here we have a question coming in.
Bonnie.
So the question is, what does the different US and Canadian contexts impacted your work and attitudes towards plurilingualism?
Excellent question. I think that when I was in the US, I did start adopting the terminology multilingualism in many contexts because it made sense, and I found people stopped engaging with me or my work because I wasn't speaking their language. And I think that that is a reflection just of the fact that we have a communicative repertoire, and we can draw on different parts of it depending on who we're communicating with. But I think that one of the major things that my time in the US really changed for me was just a critical orientation to my work. And recognizing even my own positionality as someone who was born into an immigrant family, and my parents spoke 7 languages, and I was raised as a quote unquote monolingual Anglophone, was really impactful. And my experiences of racism and discrimination in the US really centered those experiences and triggered a lot of my own memories of things that I hadn't necessarily recognized in my own schooling here in Canada. But as I was working particularly in schools during the administration that was in power at the time, there was a lot, the need for social justice and a pedagogy that was going to center the experiences of multilinguals and understanding the history of bilingual education for minoritized learners in the US. Made me more committed to using the term multilingual, to talking about translanguaging as a theory that is responsive to minoritized language users. I think in Canada, I was first initiated into this notion of plurilingualism through French. And so it was thanks to the work that had been happening and developing in France related to language awareness through programs like L'éveil aux langues, Hélot in Montreal, and then a research fellowship I did while I was there in France to learn about language comparison and what these pedagogies look like in practice, that really anchored for me my understanding of this dynamic interplay of repertoire. And so I think that both are valuable. And I think that because my work right now is focused on really working with the dominant language speakers as well as minoritized language speakers, that plurilingualism is perhaps more appropriate, because I wouldn't call everyone a bilingual or multilingual, but we all have the capacity to become plurilingual, to grow in our plurilingualism. And I think that there still is a sense in which we want to preserve the minoritized bilingual learners' history and acknowledge what has been hard won and continues to be fought. So a long-winded answer.
Thank you. There was a question from Dr. Bonnie Norton. Would you like to ask it directly? I did see your camera on at one point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just such a wonderful presentation, Gail. Just you covered such an amazing territory and looked at theory and practice and just and amazing data. I just had a quick, I noticed that in some of the data you collected, you were looking also at issues of social class. And you haven't discussed that in any detail. And I'm intrigued to see, if you had any interesting findings, or if that's still something you want to cover in the future. But it seems to me that we don't adequately address issues of social class in our field. And I was very excited to see that you tapping into it. So any comments would be wonderful. Thank you.
Sure. I think that, digging into the literature on allyship really means that we have to pay attention to privilege. And for me, that's where social class also comes in. And I think that for me, that's an important aspect that I'm continuing to look at. I think that it's been awoken in me in many ways by the work that I was doing in the US, and recognizing, working in a predominantly white institution, that there is a need for us to pay attention to how we are educating, I want to say elitist, or people from elite backgrounds to work with minoritized students. And so it's something that I'm just starting. I would say I'm in my infancy, but I think that what I was encouraged by in doing this work in schools was seeing parents who have power and privilege using that power and privilege to amplify this multilingual work. So for example, we were able to get into the public libraries and have our books distributed through the public libraries because parents who had connections use those for this purpose. And that brought visibility to the work and really centered the capacity for these schools to be producing multilingual texts that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And so the investment on the part of this library to continue to put thousands of dollars into the school so that they can continue to publish these books is huge. I remember doing this work in my doctorate in Toronto, and I had asked the public library if they would be willing to publish books, and they had said no, because they're not quality children's literature.
Mm-hmm. But Gail, I did notice that, of course, there were lots of materials which were amazing and multilingual, but I did wonder, even in that image, where the digital, because one can do so much digitally, and it's so inexpensive, relatively inexpensive, and one can share with such great ease if things are digital and open access. So I did find it interesting that, so we focus on the print,
Right. We do publish electronically everything. And we encourage students to be working on, multimodal productions. I think we also have to be mindful of the fact that for many of the students work in the schools that I was working with, they don't have access to print in their own languages. They don't have access to books. And so to be able to produce resources that are related to the curriculum and that they get to keep in their homes become books that they return to over and again. And so that is a part of returning to a minoritized group of people, providing resources that they have invested themselves in creating so that they aren't just available to people who have access to the internet. So I think there's a both and here.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to end on that last wonderful question because the time has come. And the presentation really was fantastic. Thank you so much for your generosity and all the rich collection that you shared with teachers. I think that as a teacher myself, I could very much see how strategies, ideas, and sources of inspiration could be implemented. So a tremendous applause to you. Thank you so much. And for everybody that's here today, this is our last event as a grand, sort of the grand finale. And I wanted to thank everybody for their engagement today. The presenters have been phenomenal and fantastic, and your investment in this work, your curiosity in the work is very much appreciated, and I think also represents quite a shift in where we're going with respect to language education. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.